In the previous video, I talked about the evolution of the Zaprod-finished Pezzo 7001 workhorse, found in the very first NOMOS models, into the various iterations of the NOMOS 1 series, which was a small family of feature-rich calibers that, over time, became fabricated and assembled almost entirely in-house. And by 2004, NOMOS was fabricating, finishing, and assembling in Glashütte all the major components necessary to build complete movements in-house, even if they weren't yet combining all of these components together. And before we leave the 1 series era, it's worth briefly revisiting the final 2 movements from that period. The 1TSP featured a 3/4 plate design, but an externally sourced base plate. The 1TS Super 30, meanwhile, used an older style of discrete top plates, but with an in-house manufactured base plate. With the exception of the updated ratchet, which is a Glashütte-style stopwork on the 1TSP, the other features were shared. Separately, we see 2 handsome movements that each still share a Swiss-made structural component. But combined, we have all the right ingredients to make a fully in-house movement. And in 2005, NOMOS did precisely that. The 1 series movements were retired. The majority of the remaining calibers were used up and sold off in the aforementioned Super 30 Tangente collection. In their place, NOMOS introduced the first in a series of what would be visually distinct movements, which NOMOS proudly declared for the first time as entirely in-house. In this new chapter in the Book of NOMOS, a simpler naming convention was adopted, and each movement variation received its own Greek letter designation. As I've mentioned, this began, not surprisingly, with the Alpha caliber, which is still found in many new NOMOS models today. To distinguish the Alpha from its predecessors, it received a distinctive polished rhodium plating and featured Glashütte ribbing on the 3/4 plate, the Saxonian answer to Geneva stripes. The sunburst polish on the ratchet and crown wheels remained, and all the earlier improvements and innovations were carried over as well. The various complications, of course, still existed, and when they were added, the Alpha caliber received a new name. Adding a date display to the Alpha earned it the moniker Beta. As a brief aside, in 2010, NOMOS decided to slightly enlarge the window and date wheel for easier viewing, at the same time bumping up their hand-wound date-equipped models from a diameter of 35mm to 37.5mm, but the caliber designation, Beta, remained the same, regardless of the size of the date display. NOMOS refers to the larger incarnation of their date display as the Fernsehdatum, or in English, long-distance date. Little bit of trivia, NOMOS' long-distance date is also the official date complication of single people trying to find romance via Skype during the COVID-19 lockdown. When the Alpha was equipped with a power reserve, it became known as the Gamma caliber, or Gamma for any Hellenic viewers who might be watching. If you added a date display and a power reserve, it became known as Delta. And so the Greek-era hand-wound calibers comprised of Alpha, Beta with a date display, Gamma with a power reserve complication, and finally Delta with a date display and power reserve. Before moving on to the automatic entries of this period, it's worth mentioning that there have been 1 or 2 variations of the Alpha. For example, the relatively recent Alpha.2, in which the 4th pinion wheel has been left spinning in the proverbial wind, as the small seconds hand it would normally connect to has been removed, presumably to accommodate the demands of the vocal triskophobian community. There were also some limited edition models that replaced the usual Niverox escapement in the Alpha with NOMOS' in-house escapement, which they call the Swing System. This variation of the Alpha can be found in some collaboration models. For example, the Midnight Blue Orion, Timeless Club, or Timeless Ludwig, which were made specifically for Timeless Luxury Watches, a concessionaire in Plano, Texas. The next phase of the Greek era is marked by the introduction of NOMOS' first self-winding caliber, Epsilon. NOMOS proudly announced its new automatic movement in April of 2005, and at the same time declared themselves to be no longer merely a watchmaker that utilizes in-house movements, but rather a Manufactory, the German translation of Manufacteur d'horlogerie, which in English is commonly referred to as a manufactory. There is some interesting nuance to this terminology as it relates to NOMOS and the Epsilon caliber, which means we're headed off on a long tangent. In watchmaking, there are various tiers or labels that you can assign to a watchmaker. For example, an atelier de terminage or finishing workshop is a watchmaker that orders movements, K-style, or other various parts and assembles them into watches, presumably with their own branding on the dial. This would be a fair description of NOMOS way back in 1992. Another tier is what some refer to as a Manufacture de jambon à l'heure. In German, a Manufaktur, and in English, for the purpose of this video, I'll stick with Manufactory. Definitions found online tend to be fairly close to Wikipedia's definition, which is a wristwatch movement or watchworks fabricator which makes all or most of the parts required for its products in its own production facilities, as opposed to simply assembling watches using parts purchased from other firms. NOMOS themselves, way back in 2006, provided a similar definition in their own encyclopedia. But why didn't NOMOS apply this label to themselves in 2004 when it was perfectly applicable? Whereas 1 year later, with the announcement of the automatic Epsilon caliber, they were making proud proclamations that they'd achieved this noteworthy nouveau. And yet, before this pronouncement, NOMOS was already building and utilizing their own movements, and thus already fit this definition. So why the fanfare when Epsilon was announced? What was the distinction? I would suggest that over time, as the term in-house has come to add value or cachet to mechanical watches, there was increased market pressure for companies to label the movements they used as in-house. This adds a little novelty and helps justify those premium price tags. Alright, a company might take a tried and true ETA movement, modify or decorate it sufficiently to justify the in-house label, and give the caliber a new name so as to obfuscate its origin. To differentiate themselves from such practices, NOMOS seems to be attempting to create a new middle tier, which I will refer to simply as an in-house watchmaker. This middle tier would be a watchmaker such as we've just described, or one that fabricates their own movements in-house, but the design of the movements comes from an external source. That was certainly NOMOS as of 2004. Creating this middle tier conveniently allows one to differentiate between an in-house watchmaker and a so-called manufactory, which in this new scheme would be a watchmaker that both designs movements and constructs them. Personally, I quite like this three-tiered approach, though I think the middle tier is deserving of a more clever, perhaps French-sounding name. Regardless, NOMOS seems to be saying, yes, we do the in-house thing, but that's not all. We also made Epsilon, and we made it from scratch. So that makes us a manufactory, but not you, because that's what that means now. And if you don't like it, well, you can take your opinion and shove it right up your assortiment. Except if you really want to be a stickler, that was only half true, or maybe 3/4 or 7/8 true, depending on how much you like to stickle. Because Epsilon did actually share some DNA with the Alpha movement. It's difficult to see with the rotor in the way, but the gear train and thus architecture of Epsilon do overlap a little bit with Alpha. And I suspect this may be why Zeta, with the date complication, was ready right out of the gate. But that's just speculation on my part. That said, Epsilon is a significantly different caliber. It's automatic after all, bidirectionally automatic. But if you really wanted to, I think you could argue that their declaration of manufactorydom was premature. Except that at the exact same time that Epsilon was released, NOMOS was making two other calibers, Iota and Theta, which handily earned NOMOS such a title. And although these movements were mentioned in NOMOS literature, as far as I can tell, they were rarely if ever mentioned by name, aside from the odd interview. Further, they weren't found in any NOMOS branded watches at the time. I'll come back to these two movements at the end actually, so let's just set that aside for a moment. So, at the end of the day, NOMOS was correct. At the time Epsilon was introduced, it's fair to say that they were a manufactory. But if you were so inclined, you could also make the argument that there was a little misdirection involved. Or alternatively, you could take NOMOS aside and say that the shared connection between Alpha and Epsilon is so slight that Epsilon can rightly be considered a new and novel design. Or you could say that that's not even what any of these words mean and you'd like the last 2 minutes of your life back. I'm fine either way. I think it's really splitting hairs, but in the name of being thorough, I feel like it's worth mentioning. Where were we? Ah yes, it was April of 2005. NOMOS announced their first self-winding caliber, painstakingly designed by Lange & Söhne alum Mirko Heine. It was introduced to the public, ticking within the Tangomat, a portmanteau of tangente and automat. A date complication for this new automatic movement was released concurrently, and when Epsilon was so equipped, the caliber was dubbed Zeta. Interesting to note is that when Epsilon and Zeta originally arrived on the scene, both were 24 jewel movements. but movements made after May of 2007 instead utilized 26 joules. According to NOMOS, a wheel in the automatic winding mechanism received the additional joule bearings, which were intended to increase efficiency, reduce friction, and enhance longevity. An eagle-eyed observer might also note that on earlier epsilon and zeta movements, the winding rotor bearing utilized 5 tiny ball bearings, whereas later models used a rotor bearing with 7 tiny balls, a subtle change unrelated to the joule bearing update. But regardless of the state of their joules or the quantity of their balls, the caliber designation remained the same, epsilon by itself and zeta with a date. 5 years later, in 2010, NOMOS released a GMT complication for their automatic caliber, and dubbed the result Xi, or Xi, as those of Grecian extraction might say. Xi was available initially in the Tangomat GMT, and later in the handsome Zurich Weltzeit as well. The Weltzeit at first didn't receive an English name and was simply called the Zurich Weltzeit. Later, for reasons we can only speculate on, NOMOS gave the Weltzeit an English name, World Timer, despite the watch not being a World Timer, but rather a GMT like the Tangomat GMT. In fact, I strongly suspect that the name Weltzeit was originally a reference to the famous East German constructed Weltzeituhr, or world clock, found in Berlin, smack dab in the middle of Alexanderplatz. Indeed, NOMOS has on other occasions turned to Berlin landmarks for naming inspiration. But Weltzeit sounds like World Timer, so World Timer it was. Many years later, however, NOMOS would address this discrepancy by changing the English name of the Zurich Weltzeit from Zurich World Timer to Zurich World Time, and thus eliminated any potential for confusion. So there we have it. The Greek era of automatic winding calibers consisted of epsilon, zeta with a date, and Xi with a GMT complication. But what about those other 2 calibers I mentioned earlier? Those would be iota and theta. One would never be available in a NOMOS branded watch, while the other would shed its Grecian name and receive a decidedly Teutonic title before it would appear behind a NOMOS dial. The first of these arrived in a 2006 collaboration with 4th generation German jeweler Wempe. NOMOS contributed a new movement for the Wempe Chronometerwerke Tonneau Tourbillon. A beautiful movement, one that certainly solidified NOMOS' proclamation of being a so-called manufactory, and as the name suggested, it featured a tourbillon movement and came with a German chronometer certification. It also came with a price tag of almost 80,000 euros. The production was limited to 25 units. The caliber inside was dubbed by NOMOS as Iota, and by Wempe as CW2, which stood for Chronometriewerke 2. And finally, the last movement on the list was the other half of this collaboration with Wempe, destined for the Wempe Chronometerwerke Tonneau Handaufzug, or hand-wound Wempe Tonneau chronometer, or Wempe Tonneau hand-wound chronometer. This movement did not feature a tourbillon complication, but was available at the proletarian price point of just under 4,000 euros in stainless steel, or a touch over 24,000 euros if you prefer a mother-of-pearl dial, gold case, and lots of ice. The movement in this model was named Theta by NOMOS and CW1 by Wempe. A variation of this movement would also later find its way into the NOMOS looks, but with the decidedly less colorful title DUW 2002. And that brings us to the end of the Greek era, and into the next, and for the moment final, chapter of NOMOS movements, Deutsche Uhrenwerke, or the DUW era. And so, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're in the mood, stay tuned for part 3, the final chapter in this thrilling trilogy of NOMOS watch movement eras.